Hi again then guys, and welcome to another individual car review from the lineup of GT Sport of course, and this is another day one vehicle. And as I said in the last episode of this series when we reviewed the Mercedes A-Class, this is one of a couple of cars in the game currently that I do actually have real world experience with as well. Now on this occasion, just like with the Mercedes, it wasn't the AMG that I drove, and with this one it wasn't the GTI, it was a more normal entry level 208, which I actually passed my driving test in. Now, at the same time as not being the same, of course, as a GTI, it does give me an interesting perspective had I not driven the car in comparison. And for those of you who own a car that's in the game, or have driven cars that are in the game, I'm sure that you feel a similar thing where it gives you a totally different perspective and a different appreciation, if you will, of certain cars, and also how accurate they feel and look to real life. And in the case of this one, of course, not being a GTI, there's a pretty considerable performance difference between the one that I drove and this thing. But as far as specs go, although this was, of course, a day one vehicle, which it's very easy to take those for granted and to become complacent about them. When you first play GT Sport, stuff like the Veneno and the LaFerrari stands out a lot, but over time, maybe not so much. We tend to use those cars less and less and want the newer, fresher thing. And that, of course, is always the nature of cars in general, let alone in a game, but certain cars are actually well worth going back to and still checking out, maybe even checking out if you haven't driven them before at all, and this I would say is one such occasion, because way back, very early on in GT Sport's cycle, I actually did a showdown between this and two of its rivals in the game as well, and this one, if I recall correctly, was actually the strongest of the three, at least in terms of spec, and I could be wrong, but I think that was the case. And that surprised me because the car is very understated. It's kind of the most understated of the three. And in the category of hot hatches, of course, the visual pizzazz and flair that they have is typically one of the strongest selling points. But I do find it very interesting that Peugeot has almost always bucked that trend. If you think of all of Peugeot's best hot hatches, from the 205 GTI to the 106 GTI to the 206 RC to this one, with very few exceptions, they're actually quite understated. In fact, if you were not a hot hatch or Peugeot aficionado, you could easily not even notice that it was a GTI to begin with. And the only exception I can think of is the 205 T16, which of course doesn't really qualify as a hot hatch anymore, it's more just a full-on Group B homologation car. Now this one is definitely understated. It doesn't really look a huge amount different to a regular 208, albeit of course with two very large exhaust tips on the back. Now as far as spec goes, it's actually more impressive than the RCZ in some ways. And that of course goes to the exact opposite thing, where the RCZ looks the part, but isn't the higher end model. Now this thing puts out 204 horsepower stock from a 1.6 engine, of course it's front wheel drive. It's also got actually a really impressive amount of torque, 221 pound-feet, and to top it all off, it's a lot lighter than the RCZ. A full 150 kilos less, in fact. This weighs 1200 kilos stock, so although that's maybe a little bit heavier than you might hope for such a small car, again, it's a very modern hot hatch, so of course it's not going to be as light as, you know, a 205 GTI was back in the day, but at the same time, what can this one do? What does it have to offer? Is it a good all-round hot hatch, or is it more the kind of thing that you'd say it's good for a small hot hatch, but not necessarily on a similar level to your Golf Rs and your Mercedes A-Class AMGs and Ford Focus STs. What is this good for? Well, for 36 grand, which is very cheap straight off the bat, it actually is a deceptively good little hatchback. And again, that's something which pretty much all Peugeot hot hatches, as I alluded to earlier on, have always had in Gran Turismo. The 206 RC was not really a conspicuous hot hatch at all. In fact, it's very easy to forget that he was even in the franchise, but it was a good little car. This, I think, is another perfect example, and although it is even smaller than the 206, it's, you could say, even more visually understated, I would actually argue this is a really good little hot hatch, and there are some things which definitely were carried over from my real world experience of driving a 208, which actually do feel pretty similar to in the game. Of course, the interior, the exterior looks similar, the way it handles is similar, and of course compared to the car that I drive now, a 208 feels extremely nimble, and likewise in the game it does as well. The front wheel drive chassis is very good, And in fact, when it comes to making front-wheel drive hatches, I would actually argue that France has it down to a T. Now, most people tend to think of Renault, of course, for that kind of thing, the Clios, the Méganes, etc. But Peugeot is actually sneakily among the best as well, and Citroën maybe not so much, but when Citroën does do that, they tend to also do it pretty well, like the Saxo VTS for instance. They just don't do it quite as often as Peugeot and Renault do. Renault's definitely the most headline catching of the three when it comes to front wheel drive hot hatch specs, performance, lap records on the Nürburgring, that kind of thing, but Peugeot, they've tended to focus their efforts more on rally than Renault has, and I think that wasn't necessarily a bad idea. Now, this one isn't quite so much of a rally legend in a traditional sense as, for instance, a 206 or 205 were, but at the same time it did form the basis of the 208 Pikes Peak, which can utterly destroy the previous two that I mentioned in pretty much any form of Pikes Peak or otherwise tarmac-related rallying, and probably if they rejiggled it a little bit, off-roading as well. This one, of course, is nowhere near that fast, but it is quick in its own way. You can tune it to well over 300 horsepower. Of course, you can drop the weight considerably as well, and in some ways, I think this might have even made a more competitive, for instance, Group 4 machine than the RCZ did, because as I've mentioned in other Group 4 reviews, Group 4 is a very deceptive category of racing, because generally speaking you would assume that something that's already a sports car or already a supercar, Corvettes, Vipers, Veyrons, that kind of stuff, that they would have an advantage over Scirocco's and Méganes, but that's simply not the case. Cars that are tuned up to that level tend to be devastatingly good, such as the Scirocco's and Méganes. This, I think, would be fantastic in Group 4, whereas the RCZ, it's not a huge power hike compared to what you can get out of it already, and the weight is okay. It's not amazingly good. The car is still, if I recall correctly, front-wheel drive, so it doesn't really have any advantage over something like a TT, for instance. This, even if it was made to be heavier, would still be so much more compact than many of those cars, and I think that would be an invaluable thing. Now, of course, that's all irrelevant, ultimately, because it's not an option, but I will say that the car gives a lot of performance on offer. N200 straight off the bat. I can't recall if you can detune this one to N100. I think you might be able to, though. You can definitely get it up to N3, and I believe even N400, if I recall correctly. Be careful there, because of course that's more like Porsche territory, but at the same time, it's a deceptively good little sleeper hatch. My experience with the car in real life was great as well, so if you want to try something a bit different that's dirt cheap and isn't quite as showy as like your Renaults and your Citroën DS3s, you might want to check this one out. But overall, that's it for my thoughts on the 208 GTI. Here's hoping we do get that 208 Pikes Peak, because it was supposed to be coming to Gran Turismo at some point. But for now, that's it for this review, and of course, I'll see you guys next time. And as always, thanks for watching.